Ben was not fiddling with his camera, and this is Philosophy with the People with Stefan Bertram and Ben Burgis.
Yeah, definitely not.
Today we will be discussing free will again, but also prison abolition. And I think I'm going to try and talk about, or I'm going to ask Ben why actually retributivism is bad, actually.
Okay. Fun.
Before that, I want to tell an anecdote relating to the podcast. I was recognized by someone on Reddit as being the host of this podcast. And strangely enough, not because I'd said so in a previous comment or something, but seemingly just because this person had read my comments on Reddit Ask Philosophy and kind of gained the impression from my tone in my candor that I am myself. And that would be funny enough. But it was additionally embarrassing because of where I was discovered. I was discovered on Red Scare Pod on some thread. I can't exactly remember why it was about this. Maybe it had to do with Sydney Sweeney. But basically, the thread was about big tits. And specifically, the comment thread I was intervening in, I can't remember exactly. Oh, right, it was some woman talking about her own personal experiences as such. And then someone said, surely the average man can't tell the difference between double D's and F's. And I said that surely if there's anything men can tell the difference between, it's big and bigger. And that incited him to check my profile and deduce that I am a host of Philosophy for the People.
Huh. All right. That's I don't quite know what to think about that, but fair enough.
So yes, what was your essay about this week, Ben?
Yeah, so I was it was about big tits. So yeah, it's really topical. Yeah, it was about something that Eric Levitz wrote last week in New York Magazine, where he was intervening in sort of intra-left debates about police and prison abolitionism. And in the course of doing that, he was talking about the justifications for criminal punishment. And he talked about, one of my favorite subjects, free will. And
I really like that you put him in jail on the picture.
Yeah, it's that's J. Andrew World, our graphic designer, but there's a lot of the essay had to do with prisons. It's about Levitz. It's a way of sort of communicating the subject matter. In a visually pithy way. But yeah. And yeah, Eric is somebody who I he's been a guest on my podcast. And I've certainly been reading his stuff for a long time, and I tend to think that out of people who are sort of professional pundit types and relatively mainstream spaces, he's both sort of politically one of the best people like that, and also definitely one of the most sort of analytic and thoughtful. And I think you can see a lot of that in the essay that I was talking about this week, which I should say I actually mostly agree with. Right, so there is part of what I
see. This is a classic like philosopher is triggered thing, where you read something and you're like, but you've done it wrong. You've done a thing.
yeah. For sure. This is so I definitely agree with his overall point, but there is along the way, he makes one argument that I did want to quibble with, both, because I found it interesting, and also because quibbling with it was a sort of way to say some stuff that, I've said elsewhere, but like I kind of said it elsewhere along with saying a whole bunch of other stuff. And so, this is kind of a way to say it again in a sort of more focused way, while also, engaging with something that's like, that's interesting and politically relevant, not just kind of, I have no problem with just kind of doing philosophy for the sake of philosophy and talking about teletransporters, whatever. But this is, but in this case, I guess I could kind of wasn't going to be able to not respond to this because it hit so many points that's in the overlap between what I'm interested in politically and actually also this philosophically interesting point about free will and punishment and how the two are related.
So are we abolishing prisons?
uh, yeah. No. I mean, first of
Right,
all,
so
is
that's the point of agreement
yeah,
in the essay, which, as kind of you said before on this topic on this podcast, the idea is yes, the U.S. prison system, justice system, very unjust and justice
yeah,
system, um, ought to be abolished. Well, not sorry, ought not to
yeah,
be
yeah,
abolished, or maybe abolished as is, but retained like the in the broadest possible structures or
yeah,
prison and police and so on are something we have to retain.
yeah, exactly. So my look, my view on this is that this is all original to me. I just made this up just now. Men enter into definite relations of production, and because of the development of the forces of production and these relations of production, tend to throw up a legal and political superstructure that stabilizes them. Um, Particularly attentive viewers will have realized by now that I did not, in fact, just make that up. That's from Karl Marx, the 1859 preface, where he talks about historical materialism and a bunch of other places. So roughly speaking, look, I think that the kind of prisons and police that exist right now reflect the kind of society that exists right now, which is, as our former president might have put it, if all of his views change, not good. Um, but and I think that a better society would sort of tend to result in a very different kind of legal and political superstructure that would be better than this. So I certainly, if the question is how should we feel about police and prisons of the kind that exist right now in the society that we're in right now, I think not very good. Like it's, if the question is like, I don't know, is the Los Angeles Police Department a great organization which we should all take a lot of pride in? I think no. And certainly, the prison system as it currently exists in the U.S. is an abomination. People, have, that oftentimes, in fact, in effect, it does, the opposite of what you might hope for. That rather than having the sort of relatively small number of people who are genuinely dangerous, isolated from the rest of society, but also eventually being rehabilitated back into it. Oftentimes, in practice, you have people who don't necessarily need to be isolated from society at all, locked up with people who are much more dangerous than them, and learning fun new criminal skills in the process, and also certainly in places that still have that box in employment forms about whether you've been convicted of a felony before, not being eligible for non-criminal employment upon release, which is kind of a perfect recipe for a permanent criminal class.
Yeah, I mean, I'd really like to see anyone justify that.
Yeah, no, it's really, really bad. So, and certainly just on a human rights level, a lot of what goes on in American prisons is totally indefensible. I mean, we just, I think during COVID, the way a lot of that, played out in inside the carceral system was really bad. And yeah, I think I think that there are I think the United States locks up a objectively crazy number of people that certainly by any kind of historical or globally comparative standards, it locks up a crazy number of people. I mean, it's kind of
Number one
funny.
in history, baby.
Yeah. Uh, that,
In relative and absolute terms, which is impressive.
yeah, it's very impressive. We should all be very proud of that accomplishment. And yeah, I mean, I was talking about this the other day, their producer Jordan, because there was you were talking about that moment, God, 7 years ago, in the Democratic primaries in 2016, where Bernie Sanders got all kinds of shit for saying at a town hall that just like in his home state of Vermont, people can not only can ex-felons vote, but people can vote from prison. Vermont and Maine are the two states in the United States where that's the case. And Bernie said, yeah, that should, there's no reason that shouldn't be the case everywhere. And the moderator said, oh, so you think the Boston bomber should be allowed to vote? It's like, yeah, which is, which,
I mean, is he a citizen? Probably is. I'm not sure.
yeah, I think so. But I believe so. But yeah, but of course, if that's actually, I mean, nobody's ever been able to explain how exactly that would be bad or what untoward effects that's led to in Vermont or Maine, or any of the several foreign countries where prisoners are allowed to vote.
It'll cause other states to become like Maine and Vermont, as in cold, and no
Yeah.
one would like that.
Yeah. Well, okay. So like one warm place, for example, where prisoners are allowed to vote is Israel. You got, famously not tough on crime. Yigal Amir, who assassinated a prime minister, can indirectly help to choose the successors to the man he assassinated by voting in Knesset elections.
It would be funny if they let Palestinians vote, but only the ones they kept in prison.
Yeah. Prisoners who are Israeli citizens are allowed to continue to vote. It's not a model of democracy in other ways. But yeah, right. So I think that I think that the kind of policing and prison regime we have in the U.S. is really bad. I think that the kind of analysis that I find most convincing of how it got this way comes from people like Cedric Johnson, who doesn't tell some sort of story that's like primarily racial and starts 400 years ago or anything like that, but rather basically, as I understand his point, says, no, I mean, the right time frame for understanding this is more like the last 50 or 60 years. And in particular, starting in, I guess the last 50 years, right, starting in like the 70s, that, you could have had, or maybe you can argue about whether economically you could have or not, I suppose, but you could have expanded the sort of fledgling Great Society welfare state and sort of dealt with poverty and its downstream social consequences that way, or you could do the thing that is both maybe that's both literally and politically cheaper, which is just to have a harsher carceral and policing regime, which and sort of manage the consequences of poverty that way, which is the option that we aggressively opted for in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and in complicated ways in some places bits and pieces of that have been unwound since then, but not really, I mean, on the sort of broadest statistical level, and certainly not like it's not it's not clear to me that even what criminal justice reform has happened is going to last, given that the economic realities haven't really changed very much. That it seems likely that that's going to lead to backlash and more of the and retrenchment of what we had. So yeah, all of that's horrifying.
Right. I
And
mean, when kind of they let people out of prison during like the worst economic times in American history, and then these people then went out and did crimes
yeah,
for obvious reasons. Yeah, it seems like that's not going to really.
yeah, right. And I mean, I think that there are like, I mean, the good news is that I think something better is obviously possible. I mean, you don't even have to speculate about fully automated luxury communism or whatever. You can just kind of look around the world, and even even
Semi-automated social liberalism.
yeah, even under capitalism, in places where the balance of class forces is different, and and you do have like pretty extensive social democratic reforms within capitalism. Then you get stuff like the Norwegian prison system, which is just vastly more humane and liberal than
Looks a lot like the dorm I'm presently in.
yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, like famously, like when Anders Breivik was locked up, there was a lot of coverage of this, that famously Norwegian prisons look to American eyes, British eyes, perhaps less like prisons than like college dorm rooms.
I mean,
And
the difference between Britain and the US is we're one to a room, while Americans I hear are two to a room. So actually, much worse than what you have in Norway.
right, yeah. So yeah, and it's not for life, right? Even Anders Breivik, right, mass shooter, will eventually get out unless they change the laws by then. And it's nevertheless, right, despite having this vastly more humane and liberal criminal justice system, they have a lot less violent crime than we do, which I suppose if you know absolutely nothing about the history of the Nordic countries before the 20th century, you can attribute to culture. But it seems like if you do know a little bit about that, I don't think violence is like somehow biologically alien to the or even culturally alien to those people. So
Imagine telling the average American about the Swedish Empire.
yeah, 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 exactly. So yeah, I think that the obvious explanation is economic, and I think we could achieve the same thing. And look, I don't just want Norwegianism. I want socialism. I'd like collective ownership of the means of production. And I think that in a world where you achieve that, it is entirely plausible that even less, um, like that a even gentler sort of legal system could coexist with even less violent crime. I think that's entirely possible. I don't
I
believe
mean,
people.
it's crazy when you look at like terrorists and stuff from the 70s or 80s who
Uh,
like blow up the Israeli like embassy and then they get like 3.5 years in prison.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So like, I think that I think that we could have, I don't think Norway is the end point of history here. I think we could achieve the same thing, but more so. What I don't particularly believe is that there would be literally no interpersonal violence in a world where you dealt with all of the economic stuff. And my reason for being skeptical of that, at the very least, thinking that anybody who wants to assert that, has a burden of proof to discharge, is that in the world that exists right now, not all interpersonal violence has economic causes. A lot of it does. Certainly the stuff that drives like the statistics, the actual like crime rate of a country or a state or whatever, that's obviously economic. I mean, nobody's whatever sort of cultural explanations or I don't know race science or whatever reactionaries want to like bring in here to try to explain this stuff. The clear fact is that, you know, regardless of cultural background, nobody is growing up in, you know, in like a nice, comfortable existence in the suburbs and then like joining a street gang. That just doesn't happen. So, and that's the kind of thing that like actually drives the stats, which is why I think that changing the material conditions could probably eliminate most of the problem. I think that the idea that it would eliminate all of them, all of it is a bit much, right? I think that that if you have, you know, if you start thinking about the varieties of interpersonal violence, like, look, rich people sometimes rape each other. Rich people sometimes even kill each other. You know, there is clearly more to this story than just economics. You know, I believe, you know, I'm pretty sure that in a advanced post-capitalist society, you know, unfortunately, I don't believe that like child abuse would cease to exist. You know, sexual assault would cease to exist. Even murders that like were like crimes of passion, or or because of personal grudges or whatever, would entirely cease to exist. And then, you know, my question to the abolitionist, and by the way, if when we talk about the abolitionists, we're talking about if what they mean is I want to abolish police and prisons now, then it sounds to me like you're talking about an anarcho-capitalist dystopia. You know, private security for rich people and Mad Max for the rest of us. And, you know, I say in the essay, if you're imagining, you know, if you want to sort of wax lyrical about bottom up community, you know, defense patrols or whatever, I would just urge you to think about what that would look like in quite a lot of places, and to think about people like Trayvon Martin and Ahmaud Arbery who are killed by people who thought they were doing exactly that. But
I mean, also people would like often really hate it, like the results of it.
yeah,
Like even like there's a story from Rojava which I don't know was true or it was false. But the story went that, you know, this man had killed a female relative or a lover or something, and then the neighborhood council decided like the punishment for that should be like he should go on a course.
wow.
And
Yeah.
that's you know, that's bottom up, that's anti prisons or whatever. But I feel like Twitter leftists would not enjoy it.
No, I don't think Twitter leftists would enjoy that. But you know what I think, you know, and look, maybe in a society that did that, you know, as hard as it would be to sort of stomach while you were getting used to it, you know, would be better. But stuff that Twitter leftists, and also I think more thoughtful leftists, would also have a problem with would be that, you know, I think if we're talking about self-organized groups of armed volunteers being the primary enforcers of laws, right? Like right now, neighborhood watch groups, private security guards, stuff like that, that all exists. But the plan, if anything goes really wrong, is to call the cops. If they
Yeah,
are,
even in Rojava, like they can't get nearly enough people to kind of do the community self-policing thing. So, for instance, between like my drive from our base to like the nearest town, there was
yeah,
one checkpoint which was manned by like volunteers, by locals or whatever, from a self-organized thing, and then the other five or so were all professionals.
yeah. And again, if you do have non-professionals who are the ones who are actually expected to pull the trigger if it comes to it, then I actually feel quite confident in the prediction that there would be not only not be a reduction in the number of people suspected of committing crimes who are killed, there would be a really dramatic increase in it. I think that's just kind of obvious, but okay. So I think abolishing it now seems like a spectacularly bad idea. As Fleabach, I think, said in the chat, right? You know, that sounds like a recipe for fascist vigilante death squads. But if what you're saying is no, what I want to do is like abolish poverty and then we'll abolish the police, then I would say one, calling yourself an abolitionist is incredibly misleading. That like an aboli-
I
an
want to abolish the police by instituting 20% budget cut, which
yeah,
redistributes to social services, which
yeah,
is
yeah,
just like as it's just like the worst possible packaging for the most mid idea.
yeah, exactly. Like if what you're saying is, well, I want to institute some reforms that will take us on this path that will eventually lead to abolishing the police, but also I understand that we're going to have to dramatically change material conditions before that would be a good idea, then I would say the last thing you could reasonably call yourself is an abolitionist. Like when you say abolitionist, there's an obvious historical analogy you're invoking there. And people who are abolitionists about slavery weren't people who say, well, obviously getting rid of slavery now would be unreasonable, but perhaps in 100 years we can,
The next
gradually.
mode of production under socialism will abolish slavery.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's, in fact, I mean, look, people like Abraham Lincoln, who was obviously understood by everybody to be an anti slavery politician in the broader sense. But nobody called him an abolitionist, right? Because he was elected on a platform of limited, of like stopping the spread of slavery and sort of trying to gradually squeeze it out over time,
Yeah, like
which,
freedom on birth or whatever.
yeah, which is, by the way, also much more radical than the equivalent to this kind of abolitionism, because
Yeah.
at least it was, we're going to start now, right? But,
Imagine we said babies born from today can't go to prison.
yeah. um, but like nobody called Lincoln an abolitionist, because an abolitionist is somebody who wants to get rid of it right now. So okay, so that's one thing. I think it's incredibly misleading. Somebody who hopes that in the future something will eventually no longer be necessary is just not an abolitionist about that thing. And two, I'm skeptical even about that, like even about the idea that that in a world where all the material conditions had been as changed as they're going to change, that we're not going to that we're not going to need some sort of institutions of professionalized enforcement and involuntary detention. And I know there's a kind of, Eric actually mentions this a little bit in his article, there's like a kind of way of being an abolitionist where you sort of grudgingly admit this last point, but you say, but it would be so different that we shouldn't call it, police or prisons. And it's like, okay, I guess. But I I think that if that's what you mean, like pick another label for yourself, because I think what any remotely normal person is going to hear, right, when you say I don't think there should be prisons, is I don't think we should have places where we involuntarily confine people, because they committed crimes. And if you do really mean, if you do accept that point, if you do think that no, really, in like after the revolution or whatever, we just don't need, unlike, by the way, all of the actual, like, I mean, I'm not a apologist for what was once called actually existing socialism, but I would just note that all the post-capitalist societies that have existed have still had, stuff like police forces and prisons, but to put it mildly. But we're after the revolution, we're just not going to have any kind of professionalized law
I
enforcement.
remember someone was talking asking about like what will the police look like after the revolution, and I just went to Google image search police officer, and then went into Paint and drew a hammer and sickle on him and sent it back.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I've been, I mean, even the gentlest versions of it. I mean, like, look, I've been to Cuba. Cuba is not a police state. Cubans, um, like Cubans feel free to complain, right? Like that's
Right.
like they're not worried they'll be hauled off
What
in
are
the
the
middle of
most
the
essential freedoms?
night. Yeah, I mean, it's not a it's not the kind of socialist democracy that I would hope for, at all, right? With multiple parties and free press and all that stuff. But it's also not North Korea. You know what they do have though? Cops. Like much like in capitalist countries, but in any case,
I thought of a cool sci-fi punishment while we was talking,
yeah,
which is someone that's committed like heinous crimes. Because we used to have this idea, this punishment of exile,
yeah,
which kind of fell by the wayside in modernity because there's no outside to modernity.
Yep.
You can't really exile
Right.
people because someone else has to take them,
Unless you have
and they
like the
won't.
Phantom Zone and Superman or something like that.
But no, I was thinking that people who commit grievous crimes in the far future, they're basically internally exiled to like a matrix, where basically like they're sent out of the real world into a simulation where they're the only real person and everyone else is a simulacrum.
Okay, that's fun.
So
Uh,
yeah, they can keep on their shit if they want, or they can get better or whatever.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, but
as a man, because they're the only person in there.
yeah, they'll do it by themselves. Yeah. Yeah. I yeah, I guess. And then if you do want a little retributivism in there, then maybe they know that it's a simulation.
I
But,
mean, or they stub their toe every morning or something, you know.
yeah. Um,
But yeah,
yeah.
what about free
So,
will then?
yeah. Well, I was just gonna say though, before we do free will, just like I did just want to register the idea that if you think that there's going to be at least some crimes of the sort that should continue to not be allowed that take place even under radically transformed property relations, um, then I'm just very skeptical that that it would actually be an improvement not to have some sort of professionalized apparatus to deal with this, and like
Right,
for
because
one,
they didn't have one in feudalism. And in
sure.
feudalism, they solved all crimes either with a fine, cutting some part of your body off, or killing you.
Yeah. And those kind of remain the options, like short of something like the
Matrix
simulacrum.
exile.
Yes, short of sentencing people to the Matrix. Those kind of remain the options on the table, and I think if we could agree that there are things that if that fines are insufficient for, then I really don't want to reinstitute the second one, and I would actually like to abolish the third one. Like the death penalty actually is something I think should be abolished, and and given if we have to choose, right, I would prefer to still have prisons than to have wider use of the death penalty. If only I mean, one, if even if you spend a long time in prison, you can still have some kind of life afterwards. But two, um, that if halfway through your prison sentence, new evidence emerges that clears you, you can, you never get the half you spent there back, but like you can at least have the other half. Whereas if you're dead, you're just going to stay dead because that's how death works. So I think I think if we have to pick which one of these to get rid of, I would rather get rid of capital punishment. But all of this is, as you say, on my area of agreement with Eric. So the disagreement comes about free will and also about the relationship between free will and all of this punishment stuff. So on free will, Eric is a free will skeptic. He says in his New York Magazine piece that quote, my own opposition to retribution is rooted in a skepticism of free will and commitment to minimization of suffering. In other words, so part of what he's saying here, right? This is a part of his essay where he's going through the stuff that, even though, right, he doesn't, he's not an abolitionist, the stuff that he thinks the abolitionists get right. And one of them is that retribution is not a sufficient justification for criminal punishment. In other words, nobody should be sent to prison purely just because they're bad and they deserve to be in prison. You need a better reason than that. And I'm actually pretty friendly to that as far as it goes. But when he starts explaining the justification for it, then we get into the area of disagreement. He says, my own opposition to retribution is rooted in skepticism about free will and a commitment to the minimization of suffering. To no small degree, our thoughts and actions the product of forces outside of control of our conscious selves. He goes on and on with some like free will skeptical stuff for a while. Structure of our personalities, genetic, environmental factors we did not author. Confusingly, he says this does not mean that we can't hold people morally culpable for their actions. So put a pin in that, what that could mean. But it does mean that punishment can be justified only on pragmatic grounds. If imposing consequences on criminal offenders causes them and others to perpetuate less harm, then those consequences are justified. But if a conscious subject has no fundamental agency over their actions, since those actions are at bottom, determined by forces outside their control, then there is no justice in imposing suffering on that subject for its own sake. So again, I tend to agree that just this person deserves to suffer, so we should make them suffer, is a bad way of thinking about criminal justice. I'm with him on that. I'm not a retributivist. But one, I disagree with him about free will. I'm a compatibilist. In other words, I think even if it is true that everything ultimately originates in deterministic chains of cause and effect, so that such that if the earlier stuff had happened, the later stuff had to happen, it can still be true that some things are, like there's still a meaningful distinction between things that are under our control and not under our control, just like there's a meaningful distinction between like skill and luck, even if the skill is ultimately, a matter of luck. And so that's the first disagreement. I think he's wrong about free will. Second disagreement, partial disagreement, is, I think, and he does kind of acknowledge this point later on, but, I do think that you don't have to reject free will to reject retributivism. So that's the second point. And then the third point, which I guess is the second, like a real disagreement, because he does kind of acknowledge that, is that I don't even think that the sort of way of thinking about punishment that's the most obviously compatible with rejecting free will is actually the sort that's going to be best for the kinds of moral intuitions that are driving Eric's overall position, and which I, agree with ultimately, right? Like, we want, more humane, less punitive criminal justice systems. And crucially, even though this is a point that he doesn't get into in the article, but I'm 100% confident he would agree with this. We care a lot about the rights of criminal defendants, about, people, people not, people having lots and lots of due process rights and not being, and not ending up being convicted, if they're innocent, and, and all that stuff. And I'm actually not at all convinced that, that free will denial is especially conducive to the ways of thinking about criminal justice that are going to best capture those moral intuitions that he and I presumably share. And in fact, I think that, certainly what he seems to be suggesting is this, like, and he is like many free will skeptics in this respect, right? Like, this is a very common move for them to make. What he seems to be suggesting seems to be just a purely utilitarian way of thinking about all this stuff. Well, if punishing people leads to less suffering overall, right, by everybody, then punishing people is justified. If it doesn't, it isn't. And that sounds pretty good until you really start to think about it. But I would suggest that once you press on that a little bit, like, you're not going to like that sort of purely utilitarian framework for thinking about criminal justice as much as you might think.
Right, because the free will denial kind of dissolves the significant difference between guilt and innocence.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Something we're all concerned with.
Yeah, because if you don't believe, like, so this is why I wanted to highlight that confusing sentence in Levitz where he says that doesn't mean we can't hold people morally culpable for their actions. Like, okay, well, what does that mean to hold people morally culpable for their actions? Because if there's no free will, then nobody is objectively morally culpable for their actions. In other words, nothing is objectively anybody's fault. And this is, I blame a lot of the confusion of this on the influence of Sam Harris and his free will book, because the way he talks about this in there, I think really muddies up this point. But people who agree with Harris or Levitz, who are like, good academic philosophers, who are free will skeptics, the way they would all put it is, yeah, obviously we deny the existence of moral responsibility. The way Harris puts it, and I think this might be influencing Levitz's formulation, is, well, there's okay, people, we don't have to give up on moral responsibility, but then if you actually read the chapter where Harris says this, and I strongly suspect this is what Levitz means in that sentence from his New York Magazine article, what he really means by moral responsibility is like punishment is merited, even if only on purely utilitarian grounds.
Right.
But that,
When it is justified, then it is justified. Basically, it's a bit circular.
yeah, exactly, right. That like
Well,
all they,
culpable would be useful for us to be culpable.
yeah, exactly. All they really mean by morally culpable is it's sometimes justifiable to punish. But I think that's a really separate question. And the way you can see that it's a separate question is that, look, I mean, even think about Levitz's formulation in that line that we just read. That if imposing consequences on criminal offenders causes them and others to perpetuate less harm, then those consequences are justified. But notice the disjunction, them or others. Well, it could, it could well be that having a higher conviction rate makes, is good for deterrence. That people are going to commit fewer crimes if they're more worried about being
Letting
convicted.
10 guilty people go sounds really bad.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So that, yeah, Blackstone's ratio, right. That it's better for, 10 guilty people to go free than one innocent person to be convicted, was the sort of moral calculation at the root of that idea that you need to prove not just that somebody is probably guilty, but that they're guilty beyond all reasonable doubt. That stops making so much sense because, well, hold on. If a bunch of guilty people are going free because we're being so careful that we're not imprisoning or executing innocent people, then criminals might reasonably think that they're more likely to get away with it than if we had a system where it's like, well, if there's a 51% chance that you're guilty, that's good enough, right? Lock you up and throw away the key. So it seems like it could very well be the case. I mean, look, at this point, it's just an empirical question. Is it going to be the case in some particular place in time that there's going to be less suffering overall if you lock up a few more innocent people for the sake of getting all the guilty ones, and this ends up being a deterrent, and there's also less crime, and so fewer people are raped, murdered, etc. Then yeah, look, it could be that that's less suffering. So if you're just doing utility calculations, it seems hard to rule out a priori that there could at least sometimes be situations in which having a less humane and liberal criminal justice system would actually lead to less suffering. And if you think that that's wrong, presumably it's because if you think even if that's true, we still shouldn't do it anyway, right? It's not just that, oh, well, as luck would have it right now, it's not true, right? But you think we should just generally not do that regardless. Presumably you think it's categorically wrong to imprison or execute innocent people, and that categorical wrongness outweighs, harm reduction. And if you think that, then you must think that the moral status of actually being guilty of something or not is really important. And at the very least, it's a little bit unclear to me why it should be so important if you don't actually think that people are objectively morally responsible for what they do.
Right. And I mean, utilitarians will obviously say, but actually, if you work it out, it's better not to punish innocent people or whatever,
Sure.
because it kind of the math works out. But that's a bit like, will it?
Ugh.
I'm not really convinced.
Yeah, I want to see the math, right? Like, because yeah, like this is something going back to like John Stuart Mill.
There must certainly be a point, right?
Yeah,
It crosses over where, because the current percentage of people that are innocent in the US who are in prison is like expected to be about 2%.
yeah,
And how, is that acceptable? Like, what's the level of acceptance? Probably less than that, you'd presume, but
yeah,
like
yeah,
that's not very many
probably.
at all. That's what the ratio is. The Blackstone ratio is 10 to 1. This
Yeah, that's
is
true.
what
This is way
40,
better than that, but
50
you
to
might still
one.
think it's too much. Yeah, right. That it's like, look, you can't absolutely, I mean, it's like a little bit like saying if you fought a war with zero bombs, only guns, and you never shot at anybody who wasn't a soldier, it would still not be the case that zero civilians would be killed in the
Right.
course of doing that. I mean, that there are like stray bullets or a thing, whatever. But you might
I mean,
still think,
people would intentionally get in the way.
yeah, that's true too. Yeah, but like I've so it's like, but like accidental deaths of civilians would not entirely cease to exist. But you might still reasonably think, okay, if you're fighting a just war, you're fending off invading Nazis or whatever, then it's okay to do it using bullets. But cluster bombs are right out because the level of risk of killing civilians there is just off the charts. And so, yeah, I mean, you might, like where exactly to draw the line here. I mean, I don't think I think if it's that there's literally no chance that an innocent person could ever be convicted, that's probably not achievable. But you might still think 2% is too high. But yeah, I mean, on the larger point, like this is something like going back to, if you read like John Stuart Mill's book, Utilitarianism, it's just full of these extremely confident pronouncements about all of how all of the good things are going to lead to greater utility in the long run. And I'm not even saying he's wrong about all of them, but it's like I don't can we see the math? Like where does the because like that could be true. I don't know how you could possibly be so confident about it. And particularly,
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of writing checks to scientists who are not going to pass your checks.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, maybe, right? Like it doesn't seem to be like a priori impossible that sometimes doing intuitively bad things will in fact work out for the best long run if all you care about is consequences. Um, that yeah, if people start if I don't know, unscrupulous doctors start murdering healthy patients who don't list next of kin left and right to harvest their organs, then
Grifters.
if then word will start to spread and people won't go to hospitals and you'll have worse utility overall. Does that actually mean that there's never going to be a situation in which the doctor can be rationally confident that they'll get away with it?
Right, yeah.
Uh,
It seems like something they shouldn't generally do from utilitarianism, but it doesn't seem like something they should never do.
yeah, yeah. And so it sort of seems like at best the idea that we should be like very careful about, that we should have rules that are really tilted in the direction of being extremely careful that we're never locking up innocent people, etc. At best, that might be something that has that generally increases overall utility. But I mean, how is it that you can be confident that it's never going to be the case? Like in that Philippa Foot example, where the sheriff frames an innocent
Right.
person so they can claim to have solved a murder to prevent a riot where like lots of innocent people would have died. I just don't know how you could rule that out a priori that could actually lead to less suffering.
But okay, Ben, say that we agree that the innocent shouldn't be punished for reasons higher than utility or whatever. Why
Uh,
shouldn't the guilty be punished for reasons which are higher than utility? So this is what I've been thinking about, and I don't think it's like
yeah,
obviously there's a thing of like I think a lot of the problem with rejudicism,
retributivism.
retributivism,
Yep.
is that kind of it's massively out of scope. We were talking before, like there's not really anything I can do that I can imagine,
Uh,
you know, that it would be justified to then put that person in prison in the US for 20 years or whatever. But I don't think that needs to be the only form of punishment we could do. Like, say we imagine there's a case where someone's done some kind of really terrible crime, um, but we've established on a consequentialist basis that there's no good thing about punishing them, or even they don't even need to be restrained in prison or whatever, because
uh,
of our future knowing magic utilitarian powers. We're aware
yeah,
that if we just let them back on the street, things will be fine. Say the person they killed or murdered or whatever doesn't have any relatives and no one cares. It hasn't been in the news media because we're utilitarianism, so we do some kind of government house thing where we don't tell the plebs because they'll get upset.
yeah.
Imagine that case. Would it really be wrong for me to just punch that guy in the face?
Yeah, maybe not. So maybe you could have a little bit of retributivism as a trait. Yeah, I think that I think the more you dial down the scale of the retribution, the weaker the anti-retributivist intuition gets. I think that I think that the sort of case for it is just like the case against it, right? The case against retributivism is just all else being equal, suffering is bad, and and it's good to it's good to have less of it. So if we're like if we're comparing two worlds, where world A and world B have are exactly the same in every respect, except in world A somebody got away with a crime that they were punished for in world B, and clearly, because we know that they're otherwise exactly the same, clearly in this case, there's no prevention or deterrence justification for punishing that guy, because clearly he's not committed any more crimes, and more people aren't committing crimes as a result of him not being punished, whatever, because the way we've set up the example. And so the only difference between world A and world B is that in world B he's being punished. Then like the sort of thing that feels a little odd about retributivism is that you're saying, yes, in principle, it could be the case that world B is a morally better than world A, just because there's a bit of suffering that exists in world B that doesn't exist in
Well,
world
a bit of justice, Ben.
Yeah. Well, that's the question, right? By the way, I saw somebody, Sid Nanda, in the chat, saying something about Sam Harris's justification for torture, which I think is a really interesting example, because it's certainly the case that Harris is like, I think Harris is making some like pretty unrealistic assumptions
Right. I
about
mean, it's the classic other kind of utilitarian example where
yeah,
instead of like completely excluding a class using a ridiculous example, it completely includes a class using a ridiculous example.
yeah. So I
Where
think
kind
it's
of basically US waterboarding and the tortures, long term tortures in Guantanamo Bay, are justified using an example of an imminent threat.
right. Yeah, and like the imminent threat, I think real life imminent threat examples don't. I mean, there's a lot of this kind of stuff that people came up with during the sort of peak war on terror period, like Sam Harris or Alan Dershowitz, who was like writing these things saying we should have torture warrants in the law, like that was based on thinking about, I think, pretty unrealistic examples. But
it feels like there's an imminent threat, like imminent threat and warrant are like
yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, by the time you've presented your evidence and gotten the warrant or whatever, the ticking time bomb has gone off. And there is a larger problem here that it's like, because I think a lot of what, if you really break down, Daniel Luban has like the city in Slovenia, but without the J, has an essay called Liberalism, Torture and the Ticking Bomb, or something like that. If you experiment with if you Google that, I'm sure the real one will come up. I think I might have the title slightly wrong, but in any case, one of the things he points out is that when people do justifications for torture, they often present it as purely utilitarian. Well, okay, in this slightly fanciful ticking time bomb case, then you have, you torture one guy, so you've inflicted a certain amount of suffering, but you've prevented so much other suffering because you disarmed the bomb before it, went off in Midtown Manhattan or whatever. So therefore it's justified. But a lot of times I think what's really driving it is not purely utilitarian. There's like an element of, there's some retributivism going on behind the scenes. And one way to bring this out is to say, okay, look, how about if there's the ticking time bomb, there's the terrorist who somehow you're magically certain that this person really is a terrorist and really does know the combination to disarm it. I don't know. Don't ask how you're certain of that, but whatever. You are certain of it in this example. Let's say that this guy has spent years training for this exact scenario and you're not going to be able to break him through torture. But as luck would have it, his 6-year-old daughter is downstairs, and you can bring her up and torture her in front of him, and that will break him. Well, okay, so start pulling the fingernails off the daughter, or no?
I thought you were going to go for a different, far less brutal example, where you're like, this guy is prepared for torture, but he hasn't prepared for us to be like really nice to him. Like, if you tell us where the bomb is right now, we'll literally like release you and get you a plane and like a massive amount of cocaine or 16 different kinds of boys or whatever you want.
Sure.
Because that again would bring out the distinction between someone who's actually a retributivist and is a utilitarian.
Yeah, because if you're not willing to sign off on torturing the little girl, then you're not actually making a purely utilitarian argument, even if you think, even if that's the way you thought you were doing. Part of the justification in your head is that the terrorist deserves it, but hold on. Once you've conceded that part of your justification is that terrorists kind of have it coming, then you have a much bigger problem when you start justifying real life torture, which is, how is it exactly that you're this sure that the people that you're torturing are the actually guilty people? Because,
the conviction rate for Guantanamo Bay is shockingly low for reasons I don't really understand, because I think most of the guys in there are all like real nasties, especially these days.
Yeah, these days, I think most of the people who there actually initially really weren't. Initially after the invasion of Afghanistan, I think a lot of people were, I think there were actually bounties for a while to like turn in, people you said had something to do with Al Qaeda. So there's a financial incentive. I think a lot of people were like, settling grudges with the guy down the street, and, by fingering them. So I actually think initially there were a lot of completely innocent people being detained, but it's like, look, there are, which is why now maybe we're down to the real nasties, because there were so many people who were just kind of quietly released over the years when the government admitted that it didn't have any real evidence.
It was really cool when Obama closed that place in 2009 by executive order.
Yeah. He said he would, that he did, and now it hasn't existed anymore for the last 14 years.
They all live in the US and have the public option on Medicaid.
Exactly. Yeah. No, just all kinds of wonderful things happened during those years. Oh my God, my favorite part was when Obama kept his campaign promise in 2008 to protect whistleblowers. Unlike Bush, that was maybe
It's
the
funny,
promise.
I'm making fun of stuff which happened when I was 13.
Yeah, but yeah, this is the thing. Like in real life, how do you know that the person that you're torturing is really a bad terrorist? Who doesn't have a right not to be tortured? How do you know that? Because there have been many, like people who make these arguments all seem to assume that somehow, like they've kind of been trained by Hollywood to think that there's this category of of cases where it's just obvious and definitely the government knows for sure, but those damn courts, you can't prove it there. I think the evidence that the real world is like this is sorely lacking. There have been all kinds of cases of people who've been detained for years and years, whatever, because we were just sure that they were Al Qaeda who weren't. So if you actually want to be sure that the person you're torturing is really a terrorist, then then there had better be like a trial, right? So you could present whatever evidence you have. Somebody who represents their interests can challenge that evidence and poke holes in it. The procedure that we've evolved over the centuries to determine whether people are actually guilty of things or not.
And you shouldn't torture them so much before that you aren't allowed to have a trial, which has recently happened with a Guantanamo inmate.
Yeah, like, and by the time you've done, like, if you have like a real trial, no torture, like you're actually accumulating real evidence, not just people admitting to whatever they think you want them to hear because you're torturing them. If you actually have a real trial based on real evidence, by the time this is all over, any ticking time bombs have gone off years ago. So yeah, I mean, I think that would be my objection to the Sam Harris thing about torture. And yeah, I think structurally, I mean, it's kind of it's something of of a parallel case, and it goes to the same point I was making in the essay, because look, sure, it could be the case that if we have a criminal justice system that has all these like liberal rights and safeguards of the rights of defendants, that will work out to be less suffering in the long term. Maybe. But even if that empirically happens to be the case, let's just assume for the sake of argument that that's right. Is that really your only reason for wanting that? That you somehow knew in advance that the calculations will work out that way? I'm skeptical. I think there's like a much more basic moral intuition at work here. And I think similarly in the torture case, like, yeah, look, I do think that Sam Harris and Dershowitz and all these people were making wildly unrealistic empirical assumptions, but that's not my only reason for disagreeing with them. It's not like, it's not like if you could prove to me that torture actually did prevent just enough terrorist incidents that actually it led to, it prevented slightly more suffering than it caused, I would then be like, oh, okay, cool. Let's, torture away. Right. Like, and I don't think that most people, I think somebody in the chat, invoked my friend Sam Cedar. I think Sam thinks he's a utilitarian, but I don't think he is. I don't think he is either. Right. I don't think Sam Cedar would support torture if like the calculations happen to work out so that it,
It'd be cool to talk to an actual cold-blooded utilitarianism.
because they
like, yeah, torture that girl.
Yeah. Like, yeah, I don't think he would really. I don't think he would actually support torture if it actually work, or support, like, conviction, a 51% chance of guilt standard for, for criminal trials, if it turned out that doing one of these things like overall prevented somewhat less suffering than it caused. um which is a good thing, right? He shouldn't, but I think that shows that he's not really a utilitarian. I suspect that Eric isn't really, and I don't know. In conclusion, we should all stop pretending to be utilitarians.
Do you want to see a cool Halloween mask I bought?
By all means.
I think it's very cool.
Okay.
I really love the idea of going to a Halloween party with this on and just keeping it on the whole time.
Yeah. Yeah. Just go to some Halloween parties. Do not say a word the entire time.
No, I want to talk because I think it, and then at some point take it off because I think, especially if people that don't really know you, so I think they'd construct a whole version of your face and then they'd eventually see it and it'd be very funny. I can see through it, by the way.
Fair enough.
My friend said it looked like a corn kernel.
What is that even supposed to be a mask of? Like, I just see it
No,
like a
nothing.
reflection.
It's just like it's not a character or anything. It's just the gold void. Do you know
Yeah.
when? Do you know when it comes to the gold void? Also, the kind of reflective gold void, which you can see your own face in.
Yeah. That is legitimately creepy.
Oh, chat. What webcam should I buy? Um,
Sid says here the Gimp in the first season of American Horror Story.
okay, I'm gonna play the outro, but in that time, everyone in chat should tell me what webcam I should buy. So I want to buy a new webcam. I was gonna. The thing is, I've been thrown off because I was intent on buying a new webcam, but then my microphone, my expensive microphone's broken. So I'm like, maybe I should replace that actually. But then I'm thinking if I buy an expensive webcam, it'll probably have within it like a decent microphone anyway. So
Fair enough.
okay, bye everyone.